Hello, and welcome to the first mini lecture about Chapter 14, which is talking about unemployment and fiscal policy. This chapter is huge and does a lot of different things, so I decided to split it into two parts to give you a basic sense of the model of the multiplier and how spending is supposed to be linked with GDP in the macro sense, and a second part which talks explicitly about fiscal policy. And as a reminder, fiscal policy refers to government spending and so forth. So some key ideas that this chapter goes into are talking about fluctuations in aggregate demand and GDP growth and the multiplier. This is how a change in spending should lead to a change in GDP, basically. And the book starts with a little history of government involvement in the U.S. economy before and after World War II. It then takes some time to talk about the value of stabilizing fiscal policy versus destabilizing fiscal policy, what is sometimes called the paradox of thrift, why saving may paradoxically be not so good for the economy. And it also considers the rest of the world and how this may prove to be a challenge for policymakers. For our purposes, I'm really going to be focusing on the first element of this. How does a change in aggregate demand, how does a change in spending affect GDP? So the following is a figure from your textbook, and it talks about U.S. GDP and tax revenue over the 20th century. And basically, it presents a general pattern of smoothed volatility after World War II. So the idea here is we see a lot of big ups and big downs and big ups and big downs basically prior to 1945. And then after 1945, we see that the fluctuations are almost all above zero. So basically, the idea is that government revenue is mostly above zero. The idea here is that as GDP has changed, tax revenue has changed over time as well. Brief review. What are the components of aggregate demand? Well, you may recall that in macroeconomics, we use Y to represent GDP. And the three components of GDP are expenditure, which is what we're capturing here with aggregate demand, output, which is sale of goods and services by domestic firms, and also income being earned. So when we're thinking about the components of aggregate demand or expenditure, we're thinking about consumption by households, investment expenditure by firms, government expenditure on goods and services, exports, which is foreign expenditure on domestically produced goods and services, and then from all of this we subtract imports, which is domestic expenditure on foreign produced goods and services. A lot of macro is thinking about factors that shock our system, factors that encourage people to spend more or spend less. And when we think about a shock to a system, we're thinking about something outside of their income that can influence their spending behavior. So the question here is, what factors motivate firms to spend on fiscal capital? Chapter 13 talked at the very end about how firms' investment expenditure or spending on fiscal capital is the most volatile or the most changeable component of GDP. Why are firms' expectations about the future important to consider? And the idea here is that optimism about the future, optimism about demand, is a really important determinant of investment expenditure. If firms think that households are going to buy stuff, then they will produce more. They will spend more to produce more. On the other hand, if firms expect households to spend less, then we expect investment expenditure to decrease. The multiplier itself is basically trying to figure out how much GDP changes if one component of aggregate demand changes. So the key question here is, how does a change in spending affect GDP? So we can think about the autonomous aspect of consumption expenditure, so the part of domestic spending by households that is not linked with income, investment expenditure by firms, and government expenditure on goods and services. If the multiplier is greater than 1, then we assume that a change, and just a reminder, I use a triangle, delta, to represent change. If there is a change in spending independent of income, or investment expenditure, or government expenditure, we expect a bigger change in GDP. So that is when the multiplier is greater than 1. If the multiplier is equal to 1, then we expect that the change in spending will be equal to the change in GDP. And if the multiplier is less than 1, then we expect that the change in spending itself will be greater than the overall change in GDP. And I'll break here.